Chapter 9. The Castle of the Wizards. The sun had risen over the white Himalayan peaks. At the foot of a long slope, a group of horsemen halted and stared upward. High above them, a stone tower poised on the pitch of the mountainside. Beyond and above that gleamed the walls of a greater keep, near the line where the snow began the capped Yimsha's pinnacle. There was a touch of unreality about the whole. Purple slopes pitching up to that fantastic castle, toy-like with distance, and above it the white glistening peak shouldering the cold blue.
"We'll leave the horses here," grunted Conan. "That treacherous slope is safer for a man on foot. Besides, they're done."
He swung down from the black stallion, which stood with wide braced legs and drooping head. They had pushed hard throughout the night, gnawing at scraps from saddlebags and pausing only to give the horses the rests they had to have.
"That first tower is held by the acolytes of the Black Seers," said Conan. "Or so men say, watchdogs for their masters, lesser sorcerers. They won't sit sucking their thumbs as we climb this slope."
Kerim Shah glanced up the mountain, then back the way they had come. They were already far up Yimsha's side, and a vast expanse of lesser peaks and crags spread out beneath them. Among these labyrinths, the Turanians sought in vain for a movement of color that would betray men. Evidently, the pursuing Afghulis had lost their chief's trail in the night.
"Let us go, then."
They tied the weary horses in a clump of tamarisk and, without further comment, turned up the slope. There was no cover. It was a naked incline, strewn with boulders not big enough to conceal a man, but they did conceal something else. The party had not gone 50 steps when a snarling shape burst from behind a rock. It was one of the gaunt, savage dogs that infested the hill villages, and its eyes glared redly. Its jaws dripped foam. Conan was leading, but it did not attack him. It dashed past him and leapt at Kerim Shah. The Turanian leapt aside, and the great dog flung itself upon the Irakzai behind him. The man yelled and threw up his arm, which was torn by the brute's fangs as it bore him backward, and the next instant, half a dozen Tulwars were hacking at the beast. Yet not until it was literally dismembered did the hideous creature cease its efforts to seize and rend its attackers. Kerim Shah bound up the wounded warrior's gashed arm, looked at him narrowly, then turned away without a word. He rejoined Conan, and they renewed the climb in silence. Presently, Kerim Shah said,
"Strange to find a village dog in this place."
"There's no offal here,"
grunted Conan. Both turned their heads to glance back at the wounded warrior toiling after them among his companions. Sweat glistened on his dark face, and his lips were drawn back from his teeth in a grimace of pain. Then both looked again at the stone tower squatting above them. A slumberous quiet lay over the uplands. The tower showed no signs of life, nor did the strange pyramidal structure beyond it. But the men who toiled upwards went with the tenseness of men walking on the edge of a crater. Kerim Shah had unslung the powerful Turanian bow that killed at 500 paces, and the Irakzai looked to their own lighter and less lethal bows. But they were not within bowshot of the tower when something shot down out of the sky without warning. It passed so close to Conan that he felt the wind of rushing wings, but it was an Irakzai who staggered and fell, blood jetting from a severed jugular. A hawk with wings like burnished steel shot up again, blood dripping from the scimitar beak, to reel against the sky as Kerim Shah's bowstring twanged. It dropped like a plummet, but no man saw where it struck the earth. Conan bent over the victim of the attack, but the man was already dead. No one spoke. Useless to comment on the fact that never before had a hawk been known to swoop on a man. Red rage began to vie with fatalistic lethargy in the wild souls of the Irakzai. Hairy fingers knocked arrows, and men glared vengefully at the tower, whose very silence mocked them. But the next attack came swiftly. They all saw it. A white puffball of smoke that tumbled over the tower rim and came drifting and rolling down the slope towards them. Others followed it. They seemed harmless, mere woolly globes of cloudy foam, but Conan stepped aside to avoid contact with the first. Behind him, one of the Iroxai reached out and thrust his sword into the unstable mass. Instantly, a sharp report shook the mountainside. There was a burst of blinding flame, and then the puffball had vanished, and the too curious warrior remained only a heap of charred and blackened bones. The crisped hand still grasped the ivory sword hilt, but the blade was gone, melted and destroyed by that awful heat. Yet men standing almost within reach of the victim had not suffered except to be dazzled and half-blinded by the sudden flare.
"Steel touches it off," grunted Conan. "Look out, here they come."
The slope above them was almost covered by the billowing spheres. Kerem Shah bent his bow and sent a shaft into the mass, and those touched by the arrow burst like bubbles in spurting flame. His men followed his example, and for the next few minutes it was as if a thunderstorm raged on the mountain slope, with bolts of lightning striking and bursting in showers of flame. When the barrage ceased, only a few arrows were left in the quivers of the archers. They pushed on grimly, over soil charred and blackened, where the naked rock had in places been turned to lava by the explosion of those diabolical bombs. Now, they were almost within arrow flight of the silent tower, and they spread their line, nerves taut, ready for any horror that might descend upon them. On the tower appeared a single figure, lifting a 10-foot bronze horn. Its strident bellow roared out across the echoing slopes like the blare of trumpets on Judgment Day, and it began to be fearfully answered. The ground trembled under the feet of the invaders, and rumblings and grindings welled up from the subterranean depths. The Iroxai screamed, reeling like drunken men on the shuddering slope, and Conan, eyes glaring, charged recklessly up the incline, knife in hand, straight at the door that showed in the tower wall. Above him, the great horn roared and bellowed in brutish mockery, and then Kerem Shah drew a shaft to his ear and loosed. Only a Turanian could have made that shot. The bellowing of the horn ceased suddenly, and a high, thin scream shrilled in its place. The green-robed figure on the tower staggered, clutching at the long shaft which quivered in his bosom, and then pitched across the parapet. The great horn tumbled upon the battlement and hung precariously, and another robed figure rushed to seize it, shrieking in horror. Again the Turanian bow twanged, and again it was answered by a death howl. The second acolyte, in falling, struck the horn with his elbow and knocked it clattering over the parapet to shatter on the rocks far below. At such headlong speed had Conan covered the ground that before the clattering echoes of that fall had died away, he was hacking at the door. Warned by his savage instinct, he gave back suddenly as a tide of molten lead splashed down from above. But the next instant, he was back again, attacking the panels with redoubled fury. He was galvanized by the fact that his enemies had resorted to earthly weapons. The sorcery of the acolytes was limited. Their necromantic resources might well be exhausted. Kerem Shah was hurrying up the slope, his hillmen behind him in a straggling crescent. They loosed as they ran, their arrows splintering against the walls or arching over the parapet. The heavy teak portal gave way beneath the Cimmerian's assault, and he peered inside warily, expecting anything. He was looking into a circular chamber from which a stair wound upward. On the opposite side of the chamber, a door gaped open, revealing the outer slope and the backs of half a dozen green-robed figures in full retreat. Conan yelled, took a step into the tower, and then native caution jerked him back, just as a great block of stone fell crashing to the floor where his foot had been an instant before. Shouting to his followers, he raced around the tower. The acolytes had evacuated their first line of defense. As Conan rounded the tower, he saw their green robes twinkling up the mountain ahead of him. He gave chase, panting with earnest bloodlust, and behind him Kerem Shah and the Iroxai came pelting, the latter yelling like wolves at the flight of their enemies, their fatalism momentarily submerged by temporary triumph. The tower stood on the lower edge of a narrow plateau whose upward slant was barely perceptible. A few hundred yards away, this plateau ended abruptly in a chasm which had been visible further down the mountain. Into this chasm, the acolytes apparently leapt without checking their speed. Their pursuers saw the green robes flutter and disappear over the edge. A few moments later, they themselves were standing on the brink of the mighty moat that cut them off from the castle of the Black Seers. It was a sheer walled ravine that extended in either direction as far as they could see, apparently girdling the mountain, some 400 yards in width and 500 feet deep. And in it, from rim to rim, a strange translucent mist sparkled and shimmered. Looking down, Conan grunted. Far below him, moving across the glimmering floor which shone like burnished silver, he saw the forms of green-robed acolytes. Their outline was wavering and indistinct, like figures seen under deep water. They walked in single file, moving towards the opposite wall. Kerem Shah nocked an arrow and sent it singing downward, but when it struck the mist that filled the chasm, it seemed to lose momentum and direction, wandering widely from its course.
If they went down, so can we,
grunted Conan, while Kerem Shah stared after his shaft in amazement.
I saw them last at this spot.
Squinting down, he saw something shining like a golden thread across the canyon floor far below. The acolytes seemed to be following this thread, and there suddenly came to him Kemsar's cryptic words,
"Follow the golden vein."
On the brink, under his very hand as he crouched, he found it, a thin vein of sparkling gold running from an outcropping of ore to the edge and down across the silvery floor. And he found something else, which had before been invisible to him because of the peculiar refraction of the light. The gold vein followed a narrow ramp which slanted down into the ravine, fitted with niches for hand and foothold.
Here's where they went down,
he grunted to Kerem Shah.
There are no adepts to waft themselves through the air. We'll follow them.
It was at that instant that the man who had been bitten by the mad dog cried out horribly and leapt at Kerem Shah, foaming and gnashing his teeth. The Turanian, quick as a cat on his feet, sprang aside, and the madman pitched headfirst over the brink. The others rushed to the edge and glared after him in amazement. The maniac did not fall plummet-like. He floated slowly down through the rosy haze like a man sinking in deep water. His limbs moved like a man trying to swim, and his features were purple and convulsed beyond the contortions of his madness. Far down at last on the shining floor, his body settled and lay still.
There is death in that chasm,
muttered Kerem Shah, drawing back from the rosy mist that shimmered almost at his feet.
What now, Conan?
On,
answered the Cimmerian grimly.
Those acolytes are human. If the mist doesn't kill them, it won't kill me.
He hitched his belt and his hands touched the girdle Kemsar had given him. He scowled, then smiled bleakly. He had forgotten the girdle, yet thrice had death passed him by to strike another victim. The acolytes had reached the farther wall and were moving up it like great green flies. Letting himself upon the ramp, he descended warily. The rosy cloud lapped about his ankles, ascending as he lowered himself. It reached his knees, his thighs, his waist, his armpits. He felt as one feels a thick, heavy fog on a damp night. With it lapping about his chin, he hesitated, and then ducked under. Instantly, his breath ceased. All air was shut off from him, and he felt his ribs caving in on his vitals. With a frantic effort, he heaved himself up, fighting for life. His head rose above the surface, and he drank air in great gulps. Kerem Shah leaned down towards him, spoke to him, but Conan neither heard nor heeded. Stubbornly, his mind fixed on what the dying Kemsar had told him. The Cimmerian groped for the gold vein and found that he had moved off it in his descent. Several series of handholds were niched in the ramp. Placing himself directly over the thread, he began climbing down once more. The rosy mist rose about him, engulfed him. Now his head was under, but he was still drinking pure air. Above him, he saw his companions staring down at him, their features blurred by the haze that shimmered over his head. He gestured for them to follow and went down swiftly, without waiting to see whether they complied or not. Kerem Shah sheathed his sword without comment and followed, and the Irakzai, more fearful of being left alone than of the terrors that might lurk below, scrambled after him. Each man clung to the golden thread as they saw the Cimmerian do. Down the slanting ramp they went to the ravine floor and moved out across the shining level, treading the gold vein like rope walkers. It was as if they walked along an invisible tunnel through which air circulated freely. They felt death pressing in on them above and on either hand, but it did not touch them. The Vane crawled up a similar ramp on the other wall, up which the acolytes had disappeared, and up it they went with taut nerves, not knowing what might be waiting for them among the jutting spurs of rock that fanged the lip of the precipice. It was the green-robed acolytes who awaited them, with knives in their hands. Perhaps they had reached the limits to which they could not retreat. Perhaps the Stygian girdle about Conan's waist could have told why their necromantic spells had proven so weak and so quickly exhausted. Perhaps it was knowledge of death decreed for failure that sent them leaping from among the rocks, eyes glaring and knives glittering, resorting in their desperation to material weapons. There among the rocky fangs on the precipice lip was no war of wizard craft. It was a whirl of blades where real steel bit and real blood spurted, where sinewy arms dealt forthright blows that severed quivering flesh, and men went down to be trodden underfoot as the fight raged over them. One of the Iroxai bled to death among the rocks, but the acolytes were down, slashed and hacked asunder, or hurled over the edge to float sluggishly down to the silver floor that shone so far below. Then the conquerors shook blood and sweat from their eyes and looked at one another. Conan and Kerem Shah still stood upright, and 4 of the Iroxai. They stood among the rocky teeth that separated the precipice brink, and from that spot a path wound up a gentle slope to a broad stair consisting of half a dozen steps, 100 feet across, cut out of a green jade-like substance. They led up to a broad stage or roofless gallery of the same polished stone, and above it rose, tier upon tier, the castle of the Black Seers. It seemed to have been carved out of the sheer stone of the mountain. The architecture was faultless, but unadorned. The many casements were barred and masked with curtains within. There was no sign of life, friendly or hostile. They went up the path in silence and warily as men treading the lair of a serpent. The Iroxai were dumb, like men marching to a certain doom. Even Kerem Shah was silent. Only Conan seemed unaware what a monstrous dislocating and uprooting of accepted thought and action their invasion constituted. What an unprecedented violation of tradition. He was not of the East, and he came of a breed who fought devils and wizards as promptly and matter-of-factly as they battled human foes. He strode up the shining stairs and across the wide green gallery straight towards the great golden-bound teak door that opened upon it. He cast but a single glance upward at the higher tiers of the great pyramidal structure towering above them. He reached a hand for the bronze prong that jutted like a handle from the door, then checked himself, grinning hardly. The handle was made in the shape of a serpent, head lifted on arched neck, and Conan had a suspicion that the metal head would come to grisly life under his hand. He struck it from the door with one blow, and its bronze clink on the glassy floor did not lessen his caution. He flipped it aside with his knife point, and again turned to the door. Utter silence reigned over the towers. Far below them, the mountain slopes fell away into a purple haze of distance. The sun glittered on snow-clad peaks on either hand. High above, a vulture hung like a black dot in the cold blue of the sky. But for it, the men before the gold-bound door were the only evidence of life, tiny figures on a jade-green gallery, poised on the dizzy height with the fantastic pile of stone towering above them. A sharp wind off the snow slashed them, whipping their tatters about. Conan's long knife splintering through the teak panels roused the startled echoes. Again and again he struck, hewing through polished wood and metal bands alike. Through the sundered ruins he glared into the interior, alert and suspicious as a wolf. He saw a broad chamber, the polished stone walls untapestried, the mosaic floor uncarpeted. Square, polished ebon stools and a stone dais formed the only furnishings. The room was empty of human life. Another door showed in the opposite wall.
"Leave a man on guard outside," grunted Conan. "I'm going in."
Kerem Shah designated a warrior for that duty, and the man fell back towards the middle of the gallery, bow in hand. Conan strode into the castle, followed by the Turanian and the 3 remaining Iroxai. The one outside spat, grumbled in his beard, and started suddenly as a low, mocking laugh reached his ears. He lifted his head and saw on the tier above him a tall, black-robed figure, naked head nodding slightly as he stared down. His whole attitude suggested mockery and malignity. Quick as a flash, the Iroquois bent his bow and loosed, and the arrow streaked upward to strike full in the black-robed breast. The mocking smile did not alter. The seer plucked out the missile and threw it back at the bowman, not as a weapon is hurled, but with a contemptuous gesture. The Iroquois dodged, instinctively throwing up his arm. His fingers closed on the revolving shaft. Then he shrieked. In his hand, the wooden shaft suddenly writhed. Its rigid outline became pliant, melting in his grasp. He tried to throw it from him, but it was too late. He held a living serpent in his naked hand, and already it had coiled about his wrist, and its wicked, wedge-shaped head darted at his muscular arm. He screamed again, and his eyes became distended, his features purple. He went to his knees, shaken by an awful convulsion, and then lay still. The men inside had wheeled at his first cry. Conan took a swift stride towards the open doorway and then halted, short, baffled. To the men behind him, it seemed that he strained against empty air, but though he could see nothing, there was a slick, smooth, hard surface under his hands, and he knew that a sheet of crystal had been let down in the doorway. Through it, he saw the Iroquois lying motionless on the glassy gallery, an ordinary arrow sticking in his arm. Conan lifted his knife and smote, and the watchers were dumbfounded to see his blow checked, apparently in mid-air, with the loud clang of steel that meets an unyielding substance. He wasted no more effort. He knew that not even the legendary Talwar of Amir Karum could shatter that invisible curtain. In a few words, he explained the matter to Kerim Shah, and the Turanian shrugged his shoulders.
Well, if our exit is barred, we must find another. In the meanwhile, our way lies forward, does it not?
With a grunt, the Cimmerian turned and strode across the chamber to the opposite door, with a feeling of treading on the threshold of doom. As he lifted his knife to shatter the door, it swung silently open as if of its own accord. He strode into the great hall flanked with tall, glassy columns. 100 feet from the door began the broad, jade-green steps of a stair that tapered towards the top like the side of a pyramid. What lay beyond that stair, he could not tell, but between him and its shimmering foot stood a curious altar of gleaming black jade. 4 great golden serpents twined their tails about this altar and reared their wedge shapes in the air, facing the 4 quarters of the compass like the enchanted guardians of a fabled treasure. But on the altar, between the arching necks, stood only a crystal globe filled with a cloudy smoke-like substance, in which floated 4 golden pomegranates. The sight stirred some dim recollection in his mind. Then Conan heeded the altar no longer, for on the lower steps of the stair stood 4 black-robed figures. He had not seen them come. They were simply there, tall, gaunt, their vulture heads nodding in unison, their feet and hands hidden by their flowing garments. One lifted his arm, and the sleeve fell away, revealing his hand, and it was not a hand at all. Conan halted in mid-stride, compelled against his will. He had encountered a force differing subtly from Kemsar's mesmerism, and he could not advance, though he felt it in his power to retreat if he wished. His companions had likewise halted, and they seemed even more helpless than he, unable to move in either direction. The seer, whose arm was lifted, beckoned to one of the Iroquois, and the man moved towards him like one in a trance, eyes staring and fixed, blade hanging in limp fingers. As he pushed past Conan, the Cimmerian threw an arm across his breast to arrest him. Conan was so much stronger than the Iroquois that in ordinary circumstances he could have broken his spine between his hands. But now, the muscular arm was brushed aside like straw, and the Iroquois moved towards the stair, treading jerkily and mechanically. He reached the steps and knelt stiffly, proffering his blade and bending his head. The seer took the sword. It flashed as he swung it up and down. The Iroquois's head tumbled from his shoulders and thudded heavily on the black marble floor. An arch of blood jetted from the severed arteries, and the body slumped over and lay with arms spread wide. Again, a malformed hand lifted and beckoned, and another Iroquois stumbled stiffly to his doom. The ghastly drama was reenacted, and another headless form lay beside the first. As the third tribesman clumped his way past Conan to his death, the Cimmerian, his veins bulging in his temples with his efforts to break past the unseen barrier that held him, was suddenly aware of allied forces, unseen but waking into life about him. This realization came without warning, but so powerfully that he could not doubt his instinct. His left hand slid involuntarily under his Bacariot belt and closed on the Stygian girdle, and as he gripped it, he felt new strength flood his numb limbs. The will to live was a pulsing white-hot fire, matched by the intensity of his burning rage. The third Iroquois was a decapitated corpse, and the hideous finger was lifting again when Conan felt the bursting of the invisible barrier. A fierce, involuntary cry burst from his lips as he leapt with the explosive suddenness of pent-up ferocity. His left hand gripped the sorcerer's girdle as a drowning man grips a floating log, and the long knife was a sheen of light in his right. The men on the steps did not move. They watched calmly, cynically. If they felt surprise, they did not show it. Conan did not allow himself to think what might chance when he came within knife reach of them. His blood was pounding in his temples. A mist of crimson swam before his sight. He was afire with the urge to kill, to drive his knife deep into the flesh and bone and twist the blade in blood and entrails. Another dozen strides would carry him to the steps where the sneering demon stood. He drew his breath deep, his fury rising redly as his charge gathered momentum. He was hurtling past the altar with its golden serpents when, like a levin flash, there shot across his mind again as vividly as if spoken in his external ear the cryptic words of Kemsar.
Break the crystal ball.
His reaction was almost without his own volition. Execution followed impulse so spontaneously that the greatest sorcerer of the age would not have had time to read his mind and prevent his action. Wheeling like a cat from his headlong charge, he brought his knife crashing down upon the crystal. Instantly, the air vibrated with a peal of terror. Whether from the stairs, the altar, or the crystal itself, he could not tell. Hisses filled his ears as the golden serpent, suddenly vibrant with hideous life, writhed and smote at him. But he was fired to the speed of a maddened tiger. A whirl of steel sheared through the hideous trunks that waved towards him, and he smote the crystal sphere again and yet again. As the globe burst with a noise like a thunderclap, raining fiery shards on the black marble, and the gold pomegranates, as if released from captivity, shot upwards towards the lofty roof and were gone. A mad screaming, bestial and ghastly, was echoing through the great hall. On the steps writhed 4 black-robed figures, twisting in convulsions, froth dripping from their livid mouths. Then, with one frenzied crescendo of inhuman ululation, they stiffened and lay still, and Conan knew that they were dead. He stared down at the altar and the crystal shards. 4 headless golden serpents still coiled about the altar, but no alien life now animated the dully gleaming metal. Kerem Shah was rising slowly from his knees, whither he had been dashed by some unseen force. He shook his head to clear the ringing from his ears.
Did you hear that crash when you struck? It was as if 1,000 crystal panels shattered all over the castle as that globe burst. Were the souls of the wizards imprisoned in those golden balls?
Conan wheeled as Kerem Shah drew his sword and pointed. Another figure stood at the head of the stair. His robe too was black, but of richly embroidered velvet, and there was a velvet cap on his head. His face was calm and not unhandsome.
"Who the devil are you?"
demanded Conan, staring up at him, knife in hand.
I am the master of Yimsha.
His voice was like the chime of a temple bell, but a note of cruel mirth ran through it.
Where is Yasmina?
demanded Kerem Shah. The master laughed down at him.
What is it to you, dead man. Have you so quickly forgotten my strength, once lent to you, that you come armed against me? You poor fool. I think I will take your heart, Karim Shah.
He held out his hand as if to receive something, and the Turanian cried out sharply like a man in mortal agony. He reeled drunkenly, and then, with a splintering of bones, a rending of flesh and muscle, and a snapping of mail links, his breast burst outward with a shower of blood, and through the ghastly aperture something red and dripping shot through the air into the master's outstretched hand, as a bit of steel leaps to the magnet. The Turanian slumped to the floor and lay motionless, and the master laughed and hurled the object to fall before Conan's feet, a still quivering human heart. With a roar and a curse, Conan charged the stair. From Kemsar's girdle he felt strength and deathless hate flow into him to combat the terrible emanation of power that met him on the steps. The air filled with a shimmering steely haze through which he plunged like a swimmer, head lowered, left arm bent about his face, knife gripped low in his right hand. His half-blinded eyes, glaring over the crook of his elbow, made out the hated shape of the seer before and above him, the outline wavering as a reflection wavers in disturbed water. He was racked and torn by forces beyond his comprehension, but he felt a driving power outside and beyond his own, lifting him inexorably upward and onward despite the wizard's strength and his own agony. Now he had reached the head of the stairs, and the master's face floated in the steely haze before him, and a strange fear shadowed the inscrutable eyes. Conan waded through the mist as though through a surf, and his knife lunged upward like a live thing. The keen point ripped the master's robe as he sprang back with a low cry. Then, before Conan's gaze, the wizard vanished, simply disappeared like a burst bubble, and something long and undulating darted up one of the smaller stairs that led up to the left and right from the landing. Conan charged after it, up the left-hand stair, uncertain as to just what he had seen whip up those steps, but in a berserk mood that drowned the nausea and horror whispering at the back of his consciousness. He plunged out into a broad corridor whose uncarpeted floor and untapestried walls were of polished jade, and something long and swift whisked down the corridor ahead of him and into a curtained door. From within the chamber rose a scream of urgent terror. The sound lent wings to Conan's flying feet as he hurtled through the curtains headlong into the chamber within. A frightful scene met his glare. Yasmina cowered on the farther edge of a velvet-covered dais, screaming her loathing and horror, an arm lifted as if to ward off attack, while before her swayed the hideous head of a giant serpent, shining neck arcing up from dark, gleaming coils. With a choked cry, Conan threw his knife. Instantly, the monster whirled and was upon him like the rush of wind through tall grass. The long knife quivered in its neck, point and a foot of blade showing on one side, and the hilt and a hand's breadth of steel on the other, but it only seemed to madden the giant reptile. The great head towered above the man who faced it, and then darted down, the venom-dripping jaws gaping wide. But Conan had plucked a dagger from his girdle, and he stabbed upward as the head dipped down. The point tore through the lower jaw and transfixed the upper, pinning them together. The next instant, the great trunk had looped itself about the Cimmerian as the snake, unable to use its fangs, employed its remaining form of attack. Conan's left arm was pinioned among the bone-crushing folds, but his right was free. Bracing his feet to keep upright, he stretched forth his hand, gripped the hilt of the long knife jutting from the serpent's neck, and tore it free in a shower of blood. As if divining his purpose with more than bestial intelligence, the snake writhed and knotted, seeking to cast its loops about his right arm. But with the speed of light, the long knife rose and fell, shearing halfway through the reptile's giant trunk. Before he could strike again, the giant, pliant loops fell from him, and the monster dragged itself across the floor, gushing blood from its ghastly wounds. Conan sprang after it, knife lifted, but his vicious swipe cut empty air as the serpent writhed away from him and struck its blunt nose against a panelled screen of sandalwood. One of the panels gave inward, and the long, bleeding barrel whipped through it and was gone. Conan instantly attacked the screen. A few blows rent it apart, and he glared into the dim alcove beyond. No horrific shape coiled there. There was blood on the marble floor, and the bloody tracks led to a cryptic arched door. Those tracks were of a man's bare feet.
Conan!
He wheeled back into the chamber just in time to catch the Devi Avenger in his arms as she rushed across the room and threw herself upon him, catching him about the neck with a frantic clasp, half hysterical with terror and gratitude and relief. His wild blood had been stirred to its utmost by all that had passed. He caught her to him in a grasp that would have made her wince at another time and crushed her lips with his. She made no resistance. The Devi was drowned in the elemental woman. She closed her eyes and drank in his fierce, hot, lawless kisses with all the abandon of passionate thirst. She was panting with his violence when he ceased for breath and glared down at her lying limp in his mighty arms.
I knew you'd come for me,
she murmured.
You would not leave me in this den of devils.
At her words, recollection of their environment came to him suddenly. He lifted his head and listened intently. Silence reigned over the castle of Yimshar, but it was a silence impregnated with menace. Peril crouched in every corner, leering invisibly from every hanging.
"We'd better go on while we can," he muttered. "Those cuts were enough to kill any common beast or man, but a wizard has a dozen lives. Wound one and he writhes away like a crippled snake to soak up fresh venom from some source of sorcery."
He picked up the girl, and carrying her in his arms like a child, he strode out into the gleaming jade corridor and down the stairs, nerves tautly alert for any sign or sound.
I met the master.
She whispered, clinging to him and shuddering.
He worked his spells on me to break my will. The most awful thing was a mouldering corpse which seized me in its arms. I fainted then and lay as one dead. I did not know how long. Shortly after I regained consciousness, I heard sounds of strife below, and cries, and then Snake came slithering through the curtains. Oh!
She shook at the memory of that horror.
I knew somehow that it was not an illusion, but a real serpent that sought my life.
"It was not a shadow, at least,"
answered Conan cryptically.
"He knew he was beaten and chose to slay you rather than let you be rescued."
What do you mean, he?
She asked uneasily, and then shrank against him, crying out and forgetting her question. She had seen the corpses at the foot of the stairs. Those of the seers were not good to look at, as they lay twisted and contorted. Their hands and feet were exposed to view, and at the sight, Yasmina went livid and hid her face against Conan's powerful shoulder.